The moment my mother-in-law grabbed the centerpiece off the table and moved it in front of my seat, blocking me from the rest of the family like I was a piece of furniture she'd rearranged, wasn't the worst part of that Thanksgiving. The worst part was that nobody said a word. Not my husband, not his sisters, not the uncle who'd watched me carry 2 casserole dishes to the front door 40 minutes earlier while she stood in the doorway and didn't move to help. I just sat there behind that oversized arrangement of fake autumn leaves and dried grapevine, staring at the back of it while everyone else laughed and passed rolls around like nothing had happened, like I wasn't even there. My name is Isla. I was 29 years old, married for 14 months, and I had no idea that the woman sitting at the head of that table had spent the better part of a year laying groundwork that would eventually cost my husband and me everything we'd built together, and then some. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this actually started. My husband Cody and I met at a work conference in Nashville 3 years ago. He was funny, attentive, the kind of guy who remembers you mentioned your dog's name once and asks about her 6 weeks later. We dated long distance for 8 months. He was in Cincinnati, I was in Columbus. Before he asked me to move closer, I did. I found a position at a smaller firm, packed my apartment, and moved 40 minutes east to be with him. His mother Diane lived 12 minutes from our house. I want to be precise about that detail because it will matter later. The first time I met her was at a Sunday dinner she hosted about 2 months into my moving. She made pot roast, set a beautiful table, hugged me at the door. She asked about my job, my family back in Dayton, whether I preferred white or red wine. She seemed genuinely warm, and I remember driving home thinking how lucky I was that my boyfriend had a mother who actually tried. I should have paid more attention to the way she talked about Cody's ex-girlfriend. Her name came up maybe twice that night. I don't even remember how, but both times Diane's voice shifted into something softer, almost wistful. She was just so natural in the kitchen, she said once. And then later, unprompted, some women just know how to make a house feel like a home, don't they? I laughed politely. Cody changed the subject. I filed it away under things that don't mean anything and moved on. That was my first mistake. By the time Cody proposed, 16 months into dating, at a small Italian place we loved, Diane had already started her campaign. I didn't recognize it as a campaign at the time. It looked like helpfulness. She offered to help plan the engagement party and then quietly invited 40 people Cody and I had never discussed. She sent me articles about wedding venues with notes like, "Just something to consider," attached, all of them booked 2 years out and well outside our budget. She told Cody, separately, that I seemed overwhelmed by wedding planning, which she knew because she'd engineered every source of stress herself. Small things, things that, individually, you'd feel petty for mentioning. Cody's younger sister Becca was the only one who seemed to see it. She pulled me aside at the engagement party, the one with 40 strangers, and said quietly, "She did this with the last one too, just so you know." Then someone called her name from across the room and she was gone before I could ask her to explain. We got married in June. It was a genuinely beautiful day. Diane cried during the ceremony, held my hands afterward, told me she was so happy to have a daughter. I believed her. God help me, I believed her. The shift came slowly after that. Or maybe it had always been there and I'd just been too charmed to see it clearly. By our first anniversary, Cody and I had started talking seriously about buying a house. We'd been saving for 2 years, had a solid down payment, and had found a neighborhood we both loved, about 25 minutes from Diane, which felt like a healthy distance. Not too far, not 12 minutes. That's when things started to unravel at work. I was a compliance analyst at a mid-sized financial services firm. I'd been there 4 years, had good reviews, was on track for a senior role by year's end. In September of that year, my direct supervisor called me in and told me there had been a complaint filed about me. Something vague about unprofessional conduct in a client-facing email. I was shown the email. It had my name in the sender field. I had not written it. I said so. My supervisor looked uncomfortable. He told me they were reviewing it internally. 2 weeks later, a second complaint. Different client. Similar email. Same thing. My name, my work address, my signature block. Not my words, not my tone, not any tone, not anything I would have written in 100 years. I started paying attention. I logged into my work account one morning and noticed something small, a session timestamp that didn't match when I'd been at my desk. Someone had accessed my account remotely. I screenshot it. I said nothing to anyone at work. That evening, I drove to Becca's apartment. She poured us both a glass of wine before I'd finished explaining what was happening. Then she said, "Has Mom been to your office?" I thought about it. Diane had stopped by twice in the past few months, once to drop off lunch for Cody, who didn't even work at my firm, which I thought was strange but written off as a mix-up. Once to return a jacket I'd left at her house, which she'd offered to bring rather than have me come get. Both times I'd walked her back out to the parking lot. I'd been polite. I'd given her a few minutes of my attention. Both times I'd left my computer unlocked at my desk. I sat there in Becca's kitchen and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. "She watched Cody's ex lose her job," Becca said quietly. "I always thought it was just bad timing, but looking back," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I went home. I didn't say anything to Cody yet. I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I brought it to him. Because I knew, I had known for a while, somewhere underneath everything, that Cody loved his mother in a way that made it very hard for him to hear anything critical about her. Not because he was a bad person. Because she had spent 30 years making herself the emotional center of his world, and that kind of thing doesn't unravel in a single conversation. Over the next 3 weeks, I quietly did 3 things. First, I talked to our company's IT security lead, a woman named Terry who I'd worked with on a compliance audit the year before and trusted completely. I showed her the timestamp discrepancy. She dug deeper without making it official. Within a week, she confirmed that the remote access had come from a device registered to a home network. She couldn't give me more than that through informal channels, but it was enough. Second, I went through 14 months of small moments in my head and started writing them down. Not obsessively, just carefully. The articles Diane had forwarded to Cody about couples who rush into homeownership. The comment she'd made at Easter about how my job must be so stressful, in a tone that implied she hoped it was. The way she told her book club, I'd heard this secondhand through one of Cody's aunts, that I was still finding my footing professionally, which was not a thing anyone who knew my actual work history would have said. Third, I called my mother. My mom is a retired paralegal from Dayton who has approximately zero tolerance for people who mistake kindness for weakness. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Sweetheart, has Cody ever told you what happened with his dad's life insurance?" I said I didn't know what she meant. She told me to ask him about it. I did. That night after dinner, I asked Cody about his father's life insurance. His dad had passed away when Cody was 19, and something shifted in his face. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that there had been a policy, that it had been substantial, that as far as he knew, it had gone entirely to his mother to manage, which he'd always understood to be normal and appropriate. But that his grandfather, Diane's father-in-law, had once said something to him at a family reunion that he'd never fully made sense of. Something about how the money should have been split more evenly. Cody had always chalked it up to old family tension, generational stuff. I asked him if he'd ever looked into it. He hadn't. I told him carefully and gently and as factually as I could everything I'd found out over the past 3 weeks. I showed him the timestamps. I told him about my conversation with Becca. I told him what his aunt had said about the book club comment. He didn't get angry. I'd been afraid he would. Instead, he went very still, the way he does when he's thinking hard. And then he said, "How long has this been going on?" I said I didn't know for certain, but I thought it had started before we were even engaged. He was quiet for a long time after that. 2 days later, he called his grandfather. What came out of that conversation restructured the next 4 months of our lives. His grandfather, sharp, 81, and apparently relieved to finally say it out loud, told Cody that his father's life insurance policy had been for $340,000, that under the original beneficiary designations, $120,000 had been intended to go into a custodial account split between Cody and his two sisters for when they turned 25. That 6 weeks after his father's death, those designations had been changed, that the grandfather had hired an estate attorney at the time, had raised concerns, but had ultimately backed down when Diane threatened to cut off his access to the grandchildren. Cody sat with that information for 3 days before he did anything. I gave him the space. I kept going to work. I kept smiling at Thanksgiving dinners and responding to Diane's texts about Christmas plans. Because we hadn't moved yet, we were still in the phase where she didn't know that we knew, and I understood instinctively that this was the most important phase to protect. It was during that window, about 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, that I brought what I had to the actual HR and legal department at my firm, formally this time, with documentation. I filed a report about the unauthorized access to my work accounts. I included everything Terry had found. I requested a full investigation. My supervisor, to his credit, took it seriously. So did legal. They traced the remote login to a device that had connected through a residential IP address. They obtained a subpoena for the access logs. The device was registered to a home network in a suburb of Cincinnati. Diane's address. I want to tell you I felt triumphant when I found that out. I didn't. I felt tired and sad and furious in a way that had no good place to go, because this woman had stood at the end of a church aisle 14 months ago and held my hands and called me her daughter, and the whole time she'd been quietly, methodically trying to burn my life down. Here's the thing about people like Diane. They're so confident in their own invincibility that they get careless. She had logged into my work accounts from her home network. Her own home. She had apparently never considered that there might be a paper trail, or maybe she had considered it and simply didn't believe anyone would look. That was her version of the Christmas photo shoot with the ham. The firm pressed charges for unauthorized computer access and data fraud. It was a federal matter by the time everything was formally filed. Accessing someone's work systems without authorization across state lines carries serious weight. Diane's attorney tried to argue that she'd accessed the accounts by accident, which was one of the more creative legal arguments I've ever heard, given that the emails had been drafted, edited, and sent from her device over the course of 3 separate sessions. Meanwhile, Cody and his sisters, all 3 of them together now, because he'd called both of them after he talked to their grandfather, filed a civil action regarding the life insurance beneficiary changes. The estate attorney his grandfather had hired was still alive and still had his files. Diane had signed documents changing the beneficiary designations 8 days after the funeral. The custodial accounts had never been established. She had been holding $120,000 that wasn't hers for a decade. I keep thinking about Thanksgiving, the one with the centerpiece. I keep thinking about how I sat behind that wall of fake autumn leaves and dried grapevine, eating my green bean casserole in silence while Diane held court at the other end of the table, laughing at her own stories, accepting compliments on the turkey. She was so comfortable, so entirely at ease. That was the last Thanksgiving she hosted. The criminal case moved faster than we expected. Diane accepted a plea agreement in the spring. Unauthorized computer access, 1 count of wire fraud, which carried a fine and 3 years of probation. She didn't serve time, which I'll be honest about. I had complicated feelings about that, but her attorney made it clear early on that a trial would only produce more documentation, more witnesses, and more charges, and that the plea was her best outcome. The civil settlement came 2 months after that. I was not party to that one. It was between Cody, his sisters, and their mother. But Cody told me the number, and I won't repeat it here, but I'll say that it was enough for a down payment on a house, a full emergency fund, and money left over to start the kind of future we'd planned before any of this began. Cody's relationship with his mother is something I don't talk about publicly much, because it's his to navigate. What I'll say is that it changed. It had to. You can love someone and still understand, finally and clearly, who they are. That's one of the hardest things I've ever watched someone do, and I watched him do it with more grace than I think I could have managed. Becca sends me memes about true crime podcasts now. We have lunch every few weeks. She told me last fall that she'd always hoped someone would finally follow the thread far enough to see the full picture. She said it took her a while to trust that I was that person. I'm back at my firm. Senior compliance analyst as of 8 months ago. My supervisor wrote me a letter for the promotion committee that included the phrase, composure under pressure, which felt like the understatement of the decade. We closed on our house in July. It's 27 minutes from Diane's address, which is also the distance to a lot of other things. The farmer's market Cody loves, a hiking trail we've been eyeing for 2 years, a school district we started thinking about for reasons I'll leave to your imagination. 27 minutes is exactly the right distance. Not too far, not 12. The last time I saw Diane was at a neutral family gathering, Cody's cousin's baby shower last spring. She was polite, contained. She didn't try to move anything on the table. I wore the earrings she'd given me at our wedding. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I wanted her to see that the things she tried to take from me were still mine. My marriage, my career, my place in this family. She gave me a small nod from across the room. I smiled back. Then I turned around and went to find my husband. I think about that centerpiece a lot. A fake arrangement of autumn leaves and dried grapevine moved 6 inches to the left with complete confidence that I wouldn't say anything. And she was right. I didn't. Not that night. What Diane never understood is that silence isn't the same thing as surrender. She read my quiet as weakness because that's the only language she knew how to speak. She had spent decades confusing stillness with defeat, and that assumption is exactly what undid her. There's something I've come to believe about the way life actually works, and it has nothing to do with luck or fate or anything you have to take on faith. It's simpler and harder than that. What you do, consistently, quietly, over time, tends to come back around. Not always quickly, not always in the shape you expected, but it comes. Diane spent years eroding things, her son's inheritance, his ex-girlfriend's career, eventually my professional reputation. Each time she got away with it, she got a little bolder, a little more careless. She logged into my work accounts from her own home network, her own address. That's not the behavior of someone who's afraid of consequences. That's the behavior of someone who has stopped believing consequences exist for her. They did. I've thought a lot about what actually got me through those months. The ones where I was sitting in HR offices with documentation I'd quietly assembled while still responding to her texts about Christmas dinner plans. It wasn't anger, though I had plenty of that. It was something closer to clarity. At some point, I stopped asking myself why she was doing this and started asking what I actually knew, what I could prove, and what the right next step was. That shift, from emotion to precision, is the thing I'm most grateful for. Not because emotions don't matter, but because Diane was counting on mine to cloud my judgment. She needed me reactive. I refused to be. Cody had to find his own version of that clarity, and watching him do it was one of the most painful and quietly remarkable things I've ever witnessed. He had to hold 2 truths at the same time, that he loved his mother, and that she had caused real harm to people he loved more. That's not a small thing to carry. Most people choose one truth and set the other one down because it's easier. He didn't. He sat with both of them until he understood the full picture, and then he acted on what was true rather than what was comfortable. That took more strength than anything I did. Becca knew something was wrong for years before any of this came to a head. She'd seen the pattern once before, but knowing something and being able to stop it are different things. And I don't think she could have done what she did. That quiet warning at the engagement party, the conversation in her kitchen, without her own particular kind of courage. The kind that doesn't announce itself. I wore Diane's earrings to that baby shower. People have asked me why, and I always have a hard time explaining it without sounding like I'm being dramatic. But there's something about refusing to let someone take the good things they gave you, even after you've seen who they really are. She gave me those earrings on a day when she meant it, or meant something close to it. That's real, even if everything that came after wasn't. I don't have to throw out the whole timeline to protect myself from the parts that were false. What I kept in the end was more than a house or a job title or a legal outcome. I kept my own sense of what I was capable of, and that one nobody gave me. I built it myself, quietly in the months when nobody was watching. That turns out to be exactly how the most important things get built,